Grant and the State Department of Ecology. We are an educational group of coastal planners working for federal, state, local, and tribal governments, nonprofits, conservation districts, and private consultants. We represent a multidisciplinary group of individuals.
And if you are interested in AICP continuing education credits, we do want to flag that we'll be offering 2 credits for this event. More details will be provided not only at the end of today's webinar, but also in the follow-up email that we'll be sending out. But just to flag, if this is something that you're interested in, please make sure you stay for the duration of the webinar so you can get these credits, and then we'll make sure that you're able to claim them for your needs. Also, real quick before we get started, I do want to share that this event is being guided by Washington Sea Grant's Code of Conduct. You can view it on the Washington Sea Grant website, or you can scan this QR code. And just overall, don't expect anyone to have any trouble with this today, but we are in a shared space, and so we expect everyone to please behave with respect, especially during the Q&A section and the gathering input section that we're going to be hosting later. Please make sure to share the space, make sure that there's enough oxygen for everyone in the room to share their perspectives and ask their questions. It is possible that we're not going to get to all the questions, but we do hope to have as much feedback and participation as possible. So I think everyone will behave themselves accordingly. But if you have any questions, please reach out to me and you can check out the information on the Washington Sea Grant website. Without further ado, we want to just dive right in and get into the great content. We are going to be hearing from 3 different project teams today. And so please share your questions for the speakers in the chat throughout the presentation. Rebecca and I will be monitoring that. And as I said, we'll do our best to get to as many questions as possible. We are going to be recording the presentations and the Q&A portions to be sharing on the Shoreline and Coastal Planners Group website, which we will send out to everyone who has registered following the webinar. We will be pausing the recording during a gathering input section that we'll be doing in the second half of the webinar. So just a heads up that that'll be a space to share your input and maybe talk a little bit more freely without the recording if that is something that's on your mind. But the content and the Q&A is going to be recorded and shared for posterity. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and I will pass it to Jenny Dykstra, who is our first speaker. So Jenny, please go ahead and share your screen. I will get you spotlighted and we can take it away.
Right. All right. Do you see my screen?
Yes, it looks great.
Okay. Well, thanks everybody. My name's Jenny Dykstra, and I am WashDOT's Chronic Environmental Deficiencies Coordinator. I'm a fish biologist that works with our stream restoration team in WashDOT's Environmental Services Office. And today I'm going to describe what a CED is, how our CED program relates to resiliency, and efforts in Washington, and show you where and how to get information on CEDs, proposed projects, and give a brief overview of current CED sites. So WashDOT manages over 1,100 miles of highways that are located adjacent to rivers, streams, and shorelines. The blue dots on this map show all the segments of WashDOT highways located within 200 feet of a body of water. During large storms like we had this week, these sections of highway can be vulnerable to embankment erosion, sedimentation, flooding, and washouts. And so at WashDOT, these vulnerable sites with repeat problems like these are given a special status. Chronic environmental deficiencies are unique to WashDOT. CED is a highway asset near a river, stream, or coastline where repeat emergency repairs or maintenance to the highway harm fish. These are known sites where large storms often cause damage to the highway and can result in unsafe conditions, road closures, and pull emergency maintenance resources away from other needs during emergencies. And so often these corridors are critical infrastructure and they provide the primary route into and out of communities for emergency services and supplies. So repairing the damage to these assets is expensive. And because traditional repairs often involve applying riprap to riverbanks, dredging in stream channels, or constructing hard in-stream structures, they can also harm fish. To address this conflict between WashDOT's need to protect the highway and Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife's requirement to protect fish life, in 2002, we made a commitment to Department of Fish and Wildlife to construct long-term improvements at these sites that reduce the need for repeat repairs and are better for fish. So we signed an MOA with them that established the CED program to inventory these sites, prioritize them with respect to their impacts on fish, procure funds, and construct long-term nature-based highway protection projects that reduce impact to fish from repeat repairs and maintenance. And so the MOA that we signed describes a specific process that is led by the CED coordinator. And most of this process occurs during planning and pre-scoping of CED projects. It includes a hydrological analysis and a collaborative alternative selection process that results in a concurrence with Department of Fish and Wildlife on a proposed concept. So the goals of the CED program are to protect state transportation infrastructure, reduce the need for emergency repairs and maintenance that impact fish, to improve fish habitat by using nature-based methods in these projects, increase the safety and resiliency of our highways, and also to simplify permitting and support Department of Fish and Wildlife's mandate to protect fish life. So CED projects use nature-based techniques that mimic natural processes and improve habitat, primarily using bioengineering and large wood structures. And the scale of these projects can vary, with some consisting of a localized structure, like this large wood revetment along a riverbank, or a new culvert. While some are also very large and complicated, like this recently constructed dynamic revetment coastline protection project that mimics a natural cobble beach. Or it could be a bridge with an interchange reconfiguration, a road relocation, or a stream realignment. So most of the CED process occurs in the pre-scoping and planning stage of a project. And because CED projects are unique and improvement projects can be large and complicated, they need to be included in our planning studies. And we made a commitment to Department of Fish and Wildlife to address these sites as we are able to get fund. And WashDOT has limited environmental improvement budget to construct these projects. There's also an expectation that we will consider addressing CED sites during other transportation projects that we are constructing. And so not considering them in planning can result in a missed opportunity for a holistic solution that addresses multiple WashDOT needs. So there are many benefits of including CEDs in resiliency planning. CED projects improve fish habitat, reduce maintenance, improve public safety, climate resilience, and many other agency priorities. Therefore, they're often eligible for grants. CED projects are multidisciplinary, and the process engages potential partners and stakeholders. And often we've already begun coordination with Department of Fish and Wildlife, the tribes, and local entities. So it's important to work on these large-scale problems in a coordinated way. The CED process also produces technical information that is helpful for later project development. And other technical information and planning studies that others do at these sites are also useful in CED project planning. And it's often required for CED project development. So it's very important that we coordinate with everybody involved and take a forward-looking approach at solving these vulnerability problems. So all of our available resources can be accessed from our CED webpage in the construction and planning section of our WashDOT website. And most of these CEDs are located along shorelines and in mountain passes throughout the state. So location and status of these CED sites can be found in the Fish Passage CED interactive web map. And that is also accessed from our CED webpage. And then I can provide two other resources directly by request. These include our current CED priority ranking. This is updated annually. And WashDOT Capital Programs uses this list to prioritize CED projects for construction. I just completed this most recent prioritization last month. And then also I can provide a CED inventory spreadsheet that you can apply filters to, and it lists all of our active, stable, and resolved CEDs with additional site information. And then I update this quarterly. So contact me for more information on any of our CED sites or any locations that you're aware of that we are working on that you're interested in providing input to us on. So here is a list of the top 15 active CED sites from our 2025 CED priority list. It shows the CED problem, the proposed solution, and the status of the project right here. We currently have 37 active CED sites throughout the state. 9 of these currently have CED projects in delivery. These ones are highlighted in green. And so as you can see, we've got quite a few that are currently under construction in our agency. And so here also is a list of recently constructed CED projects. These 13 projects were constructed since 2022. And some of these were funded with CED funds, but many are constructed using other sources such as Fish Passage funds, emergency funds, maintenance, grants, or in partnership with others. So I'm going to just shift gears and give an example scenario on the SR 300 Union River Estuary CED. And it's a complex scenario at an active CED site, and that's so that you can see how we use this information. The Union River CED is located along Hood Canal shoreline east of Belfair. It's in a rapidly developing residential community, and it is the primary transportation route to Belfair from the communities on the north and east shore of Hood Canal. The CED is a 1-mile stretch of SR 300. It's a narrow roadway. It doesn't have a shoulder. It's up against the intertidal zone of the estuary, and it has a deficient, undersized, eroding bridge over the Union River and 2 injunction relevant culverts. Oops, sorry about that. And so this stretch of highway has frequent flooding, roadway closures, and embankment and bridge erosion, which can limit or cut off access to Belfair from adjacent communities. The CED site was nominated in 2009 and is currently a high priority CED need. At the time, we produced a hydrological assessment and alternatives analysis and held a CED concurrence with Department of Fish and Wildlife. There are also several adjacent habitat resiliency efforts and potential partners, including, Department of Fish and Wildlife, the South Puget Sound Wildlife Area is there, and there was a recent levee setback and estuary restoration project, and so there are potential partners on constructing or designing and constructing a long-term repair. So after we did the hydrological assessment, WashDOT Olympic Region and CED program proposed relocating 1 mile of SR 300 to the north away from the shoreline and replacing the Union River crossing with a new bridge. And this is a very complex solution, and it would affect a large area in the community and multiple resources. So any project here will need to work with others in partnership to develop an effective project. So if a potential partner were working on a project near a washed-out highway and was interested in finding out if the corridor contains a CED site, from the web map, you would identify that there is an active CED site in the study corridor, and then contact the CED coordinator, which is me, for additional information. And then include the relevant information in your study that you're working on. And consider the status and nature of the CED problem, the assets involved in our proposal to relocate the roadway. And the level of detail may vary depending on the scale and focus of your study, and I can help determine that detail needed and how we might work with you. So in summary, WashDOT CED program is focused on increasing the resiliency of our state highways from environmental threats. WashDOT has an obligation to address CED sites, and we address them when we can as part of other projects. CED sites are complex and they're unique, and they have different levels of complexity and types of fixes. So many require partnering with others to implement these solutions. And then contact me for more information about our CED program or any CED site, its status or proposed solutions, and potential partnership opportunities. And so with that, thank you for learning about our CED program.
Thank you, Jenny. We have about 5 minutes for questions. So if you have a question for Jenny, please either raise your virtual hand or you can use the chat, and Teresa is right on it. She's asking, does the CED program have an annual budget? And if yes, what is it?
It's not, well, it's the CED funds are dedicated by the legislature during each biennium, and it varies. It's pretty limited considering the amount of need that we have. This current biennium's legislative funding was at $15 million, although last biennium it was more like 5. So it does vary depending on how much the legislature decides to commit to this program from one biennium to another.
Any other questions? All right, if you think of questions for Jenny, you can still put them in the chat throughout the webinar and we'll try to get to them. So we are going to move on to our next topic.
Let me share my screen 1 second.
And I will work on getting folks spotlighted as well. Just one quick thing, Chelsea, if you are here in the webinar and you're maybe under a different name, please just holler in the chat so we can identify you. Thanks. And I will get everyone spotlighted now.
I am here. I'll double check and see if there's something, an issue with my name or not. Let's see.
Oh, I think you're showing up as Jenny. There's 2 Jennys. Okay, I will get that fixed prior to you speaking.
Thanks. That's my fault, I think.
Chelsea, you could probably change your name where you're logged in. That would take care of it.
Yeah, I'll take care of that. Thank you. I'll let you know if I have trouble.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm Sam Giannakos, a coastal engineer with ecology and the applied coastal research and engineering team. I also work on the interagency cohort team, working on coastal resilience across Western Washington with Sea Grant, EMD, and Washington State University Extension. And myself and the others on this project team, we're going to be talking to you about this coastal transportation vulnerability and planning study we're working on with WashDOT. Just to highlight the project a little bit before we get into the details, It's a collaborative partnership funded through NIFWIF, through a NOAA grant. And the concept of this project kind of came out years ago, as ecology was taking inventory of all the coastal resilience issues across the state. Realized there was a growing number of resilience issues and a massive need to address them. The emphasis being that these coastal hazards were impacting various different areas that we all work in, including loss of habitat, damage to community infrastructure like homes and businesses, of course, critical infrastructure that WashDOT manages, and these were having disruptions to economy and other social and cultural impacts for various communities. Concurrently, there are also all of these really amazing studies and programs being led by tons of different experts within our agencies. I think about like the Ian Miller sea level rise studies that are ongoing with Sea Grant. Jenny just laid out the CED program with WashDOT so well, and also thinking about ESRP with Fish and Wildlife. You know, there's tons of different experts working on these same issues, concurrent to all of these hazards we're noting. And so this project was really an opportunity to capitalize on all of those different experts and how to bring them all into one room and try to create some sort of a communication pathway so that we can integrate all of the different great work that's being done to really address all of those coastal resilience issues in a more proactive and efficient way. The main goals of this project are focused on WashDOT's infrastructure, assessing vulnerability across the 15 coastal counties of Washington, mainly focusing on those transportation aspects, but also trying to identify various potential resilience initiatives that bring together the three prongs of the triple bottom line, as you might hear it called, which are people, habitats, and infrastructure. And so kind of overlaying those three main components across our coastal hazards, how can we identify a string of 3 to 6 projects that are focused with multi-benefit nature-based solutions, but kind of address the missions and the priorities of the multiple agencies working on the project. Here is a study map of the project itself. Can see the orange area essentially outlines our coastal zone that we're working in. There's a 200-meter buffer from the shoreline going inland, and then we also are extending into the major bays and up the Columbia just into Wahkiakum County. So a pretty vast study area, looking at all of the state roadway that interacts with that boundary. And then also the 5 hazard scenarios that are being evaluated for that zone. Just to provide a couple of examples briefly to give you a sense of what we're looking at here. Here are some snapshots of the vulnerability maps overlaying the sea level rise inundation scenarios in the Pacific Coast, Strait of Juan de Fuca, and the Puget Sound. So this is really step one, is overlaying just those hazard scenarios into the infrastructure. And then the next phase of the project is what's shown here, which is integrating the other pieces of the project, which are, WDFW's critical habitat inventory, other important WashDOT infrastructure. There on the left side of the roadway, you can see some culverts, and there's not a ton in this example, but other examples show bridges, tunnels, multiple culverts, and how that all comes together. So you've got your inundation maps, and you can see a very draft form of the prioritization of how those roadways are scored based on various other factors. I do want to emphasize that as part of this prioritization and vulnerability assessment, there is also qualitative information being collected from tribal engagement and community engagement to understand the impacts at both the community and tribal level, and kind of building that information into these maps to corroborate and understand if these maps, based on the data that's being presented, are accurate to what the folks that live in those areas are actually experiencing. And so briefly, I kind of wanted to just highlight the partnership that we're working in. We kind of outlaid our our various missions and priorities, and then we'll break into a panel to discuss how these all fit together. So from the ecology side, our mission is protect, preserve, and enhance Washington's environment for current and future generations, with a focus on climate resilience, environmental justice, and environmental impacts. I think how that fits into this project as a whole, I think, is looking at ecology as the steward of the grant itself. How do we make sure all of the different pieces on this grant are playing together, and making sure all of those various partnerships and agency prioritization pieces are coming together and are balanced throughout the work, and ultimately creating multi-benefit solutions that do consider all of the different pieces at play. And then I'll hand it over to Susan at WashDOT.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Susan Kanzler, Stream Restoration Program Manager within WashDOT's Environmental Services Office. And my work at WashDOT mostly focused on fish passage and the CED program Jenny Dykstra spoke about earlier today. And from WashDOT's perspective, the Coastal Transportation Vulnerability Assessment, also known as the Triple Bottom Line or TBL, works towards WashDOT's asset management and resilience goals. WashDOT's mission is to provide and support safe, reliable, and cost-effective transportation options to improve livable communities and economic vitality for people and businesses. And we maintain and operate the state's highway system while climate change presents new challenges due to extreme storm events and sea level rise. And the Coastal Transportation Vulnerability Study helps us understand these risks to our transportation system and can help us inform projects so that they could better address potential hazards in the future. And the TBL builds upon WashDOT's 2011 Climate Impacts Vulnerability Assessment. In 2010, WashDOT used a grant from Federal Highway Administration to assess future impacts of changing environmental conditions, and developed a 2011, we developed the Climate Impacts Vulnerability Assessment, also known as CIVA. The 2011 CIVA was mostly qualitative and focused on vulnerability of transportation assets across Washington state. And while the Triple Bottom Line builds upon CIVA and is more data-driven and focused on coastal transportation assets. There's a lot more climate data available today than we had in 2011. So the Triple Bottom Line is a lot more quantitative than CIVA. There are some areas where there have been updates and information, particularly around precipitation and sea level rise, and it gives us a new picture of both risk and vulnerability to our assets. We want to better understand what that means when there's a risk to transportation assets and how it impacts communities around it. The Coastal Transportation Vulnerability Study is about the triple bottom line, including baseline needs for people, infrastructure, and habitat. And we're excited about taking a collaborative approach by bringing everyone together, partnering with Ecology, Washington Sea Grant, WDFW, and others. We have an opportunity to broaden the scope of the Coastal Vulnerability Assessment and Prioritization Framework to include multiple benefits beyond what WashDOT would be able to accomplish alone as a transportation agency, to include benefits to fish and wildlife, for example. We really wouldn't have an opportunity to work on the other aspects if not for the partnership. We're addressing transportation, resilience, fish and wildlife, and social vulnerability. And this approach we're taking is different than the way we usually do things as a transportation agency. The bulk of the work so far has been focused on data collection and data analysis for the vulnerability assessment of transportation assets. and the project. We will identify projects that will increase resilience of WashDOT assets and increase resilience through using nature-based solutions. So we're pretty excited about this partnership and looking forward to the results and identifying those future projects that will increase resilience of our highways. So now I'll turn it over to Harriet Morgan with the Fish and Wildlife to share her perspective on the TPL.
Great. Thanks so much, Susan. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Harriet Morgan. I'm the climate change coordinator at Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. I sit in the director's office. And we are thrilled to be part of this project. And I think our agency's involvement in the Triple Bottom Line project is really a reflection of our agency's role, kind of as outlined on this slide here, as the state's fish and wildlife steward, as well as our longstanding engagement in both coastal and nearshore ecosystems. And I think hopefully has been made clear so far by both Sam and Susan that DFW, right, is not leading the Triple Bottom Line effort or making these transportation decisions. I think what DFW's participation really helps do is link natural resource management, community resilience, and infrastructure planning, specifically by demonstrating how nature-based solutions. So when we're saying this, we're talking about things like restoring estuaries, restoring nearshore processes, sediment dynamics and systems, and how those kinds of solutions can really protect infrastructure, reduce flood and erosion risks, and provide co-benefits for fish, wildlife, and coastal communities. And I think this is such an exciting partnership and sort of the way state agencies need to be doing projects sort of with this more holistic mindset and approach. So it's just such a fantastic opportunity for us to come to the table, for Ecology to have pursued this grant, to have been managing it for us, that enables us to all sit in the same room together. So to talk a little bit more about the pieces of what DFW is bringing to the table, I think a real central contribution of DFW to the Triple Bottom Line is sort of our science and habitat expertise, specifically a really robust understanding that our staff have of how nearshore ecosystem processes and systems function throughout time. So this, again, is a really strong emphasis on process-based restoration, which are approaches that are focused on restoring or maintaining both the physical, hydrological, as well as biological processes that really enable ecosystems to adapt, reorganize, and persist under changing conditions, right, that have been made very clear to us over this past week in Washington State. And from our agency's perspective, resilience is really not only about the presence of habitat existing on the landscape or the features itself, but it's really about whether those underlying processes are intact enough for those systems to respond to disturbance, variability, and long-term change that we know is sort of an inherent part of our reality. And I think this process-based lens really shapes how the agency interprets habitat benefit within this project, within the Triple Bottom Line specifically. So right, rather than focusing on fixed or static outcomes, we're really focused on building into the project methodology, identifying where natural processes, so things like sediment movement, tidal exchange, freshwater inputs, and habitat connectivity are likely to confer resilience, and where constraints or uncertainty limit that capacity in the system. And our hope is that this perspective really helps avoid overstating benefits and keeps the focus or keeps the light on conditions that enable ecosystems to function and recover. So in addition to sort of that process-based restoration lens, another piece I think that the agency brings is our context from our experience administering and coordinating habitat-focused grant programs, such as the Habitat Strategic Initiative LEAD, so our HSIL program, as well as our Estuary and Salmon Restoration Program, ESRP. And so, like, while the agency in this project setting is not evaluating project feasibility or funding decisions within the TBL, I think our experience in these grant spaces really provides familiarity with the kinds of restoration approaches that are commonly pursued along Washington's coast, including projects that are designed to reestablish those natural processes rather than solely relying on fixed structure solutions. And then the final thing that I'd be remiss not to mention is sort of the interesting nature of this project, where oftentimes when we've seen coastal hazard projects, they're focused on Puget Sound or they're focused on the Pacific coast. And this, as Sam showed in his slide, is a very broad geographic range of this project. So we have elements of Puget Sound and we have elements of the Pacific coast. And data availability differs between those two geographies along our coastal counties. And so one of the pieces that's been so educational for me as an individual and a practitioner has been bringing in WDFW's Region 6 staff. So in Fish and Wildlife, Region 6 is our coastal region. It covers Clallam, Grays Harbor, Jefferson, Kitsap, Mason, Pacific, Pierce, and Thurston County. So a broad area. And, you know, unlike Puget Sound, where a lot of restoration planning benefits from sort of integrated and widely available data sets, the Pacific Coast still depends heavily on staffing and community expertise in understanding what is happening on the ground. And so Region 6 staff sort of bringing this direct experience with coastal systems, shoreline protection contexts, regional variability has really been critical, and ensuring those geographies are well represented in the project. And I think specifically this knowledge has really helped ensure that discussions around process-based resilience are grounded in like the local geomorphology, the local habitat conditions, and the local management realities of the Pacific Coast, rather than sort of extrapolating data that we have from Puget Sound. And so I think when we sort of think about this holistically, WDFW's role in the Triple Bottom Line project is really to bring habitat and ecosystem science, a process-based restoration lens, regulatory insight, as well as coastal place-based knowledge that to help ensure that the resilience investments that we're seeking to make as a state support functioning natural systems throughout time and throughout the life of that infrastructure. So that these investments can continue to confer sort of ecological benefits, but also benefits to our communities, and benefits that they may see through time. And with that, I think I am turning it over to Sydney. So thanks so much.
Thanks, Harriet. Hi, everyone. To introduce myself again, I'm Sydney Fishman, and in addition to being the co-organizer of the Shoreline and Coastal Planners Group, I am also the Coastal Management Specialist at Washington Sea Grant and one of several Washington Sea Grant staff who are part of this project. And so for this portion of the presentation, I will be wearing my Sea Grant staff hat, my Triple Bottom Line or Coastal Transportation Vulnerability Project team member hat. And I'm really excited to talk about the role that Washington Sea Grant is playing in this project, because not only is the project a natural fit for Washington Sea Grant, but I think it's a great representation of working across not just the state agency family, but broadening the ability of different parts of our state family beyond just the agencies to participate and leveraging different expertise that we have throughout Washington. So as I mentioned, Washington Sea Grant, we're really excited. Thank you, Ecology and others, for inviting us to participate in this project. If you're not familiar with Washington Sea Grant, we are part of the University of Washington and also a network of over 30 different Sea Grant programs across the country. So we are funded in part by the federal government, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and also from this Washington State Legislature. We also pursue competitive grants and participate in grant-funded projects like the project that we're talking about today. And this project, which the Triple Bottom Line represents an intersection of coastal ecosystem considerations, transportation considerations, and community considerations, it aligns really nicely with Washington Sea Grant's intersecting and shared focus areas. So as I said, we're really excited to be participating in this project because it aligns directly with the main things that we like to focus on. One of them being a focus on preserving, restoring, and promoting healthy coastal ecosystems, And we also have a strong focus on thriving, resilient coastal communities and economies. Obviously, the health of our communities, the health of our economies, and our ecosystems are very strongly intertwined. And this project is a strong recognition of how all of those things come together to form this larger perspective, the triple bottom line, as we've been alluding to, kind of the working title of our project. I do want to flag the role that Washington Sea Grant plays and point out how we are a little bit different than the other partners on this project. Because, as I said earlier, we are not a state agency. We don't have any regulatory authority, we don't issue any rules, and we don't construct capital projects like some of the other folks on the call do. But as I said, we are part of the larger state family through the University of Washington. And I like to think about our role as this last bullet point. We refer to ourselves as boundary spanners. We don't fit neatly in any one box, but we know how to play in lots of different spaces and we know lots of folks. And so we serve, I don't know, maybe it's overstating our role, but the glue or kind of talking in different languages to bring folks together. So, as I said, we're not a state agency, but we're part of the larger state family, and we're familiar with the different state agencies and how they operate. And many of the Sea Grant staff on this project have either worked closely with state agencies before or have, in fact, worked at state agencies. I used to work at the Department of Ecology, and so the staff are able to leverage their knowledge and familiarity with how the different state agencies operate. As I said, we are also a part of the University of Washington. Our staff are technical experts. We produce scientific information, for example, the sea level rise projections that Sam mentioned earlier. However, we're not faculty in the same way that you might think of folks at the university, and we're not tied to maybe the academic calendar and the academic bureaucracy that folks might think about when they think about some of the downsides of working with a university. So we are a university, but we operate a little bit differently, which gives us a little bit more freedom and flexibility to pursue these projects on the timelines that fit better with state agencies. And finally, many of our staff have been working with and in coastal communities, working with different local governments, working with different tribal governments throughout our region. And so we have a deep engagement and a very deep bench of folks who have a strong understanding of what's going on the ground, what the different coastal resilience and coastal economic challenges are across our state and how they vary. As Harriet mentioned, there's a lot of variability between what's going on in different parts of Puget Sound, what's going on the Pacific coast, and every community's needs are slightly different and informed by what's happening on the ground. So Washington Sea Grant staff bring those connections and those networks, and yet we also have a regional perspective. We can step back and look at the patterns of what's going on across different coastal communities, different local and tribal governments to form this regional picture that's informed by what's happening on the ground. So all of this as what I call our boundary spanning role positions us to facilitate two-way flows of information between this project team and between the communities who are not only impacted by the work that the state agencies do, but of course impacted by the coastal hazards and changes to coastal ecosystems and economies. So especially during the upcoming community engagement portion of this project, which will be taking place starting in 2026 and is going to be led by Washington Sea Grant with the whole team involved, of course. So as I mentioned, this two-way flow of information. Yes, the project team is going to be bringing technical information and potential project ideas to different communities and to tribal organizations to share what we've been working on. And of course, the vulnerability assessment is going to be available for anyone who wants to check it out once it's finished. And yet also, we don't want it to just be a one-way flow of here's what the state agencies found and this is what we're going to do about it. That is not the way that the state wants to operate. And it's also not the best way to address the shared challenges of ecosystems, people, and roadways, because it's the local folks who know exactly where the road washes out. It's the local folks who have the strongest concerns and knowledge around what's happening with their local ecosystems and economies. And additionally, it's the local folks who ultimately need to support the projects and will have the best ideas about what will work, what's feasible, and what's acceptable at the local level. And so through the community engagement process that we'll be leading in 2026, not only will we be bringing that information to those communities, but also we're really excited to hear feedback and reactions to the results of the vulnerability assessment so that the state agencies can design better projects, design more meaningful projects, and projects that are ultimately going to do the best job at addressing that shared challenge of transportation, ecosystems, and community needs that we can really only get to by speaking directly with communities. So that's an overview of Washington Sea Grant's role, and hopefully across the 4 different agencies, you've kind of understood the ethos and the mindset that we're bringing, and also some of the challenges of working together with the different agencies and the different perspectives. Sam, do you want me to pass it back to you to finish up the slides while we maybe prompt folks to put some questions in the chat?
Sure. I think that was it for the presentation. I'll put up the contact information while y'all tee it up, and then I think we'll stop sharing for the questions.
Excellent. So I also just put a link to the project page, which is on the Washington Coastal Hazards Resilience Network if you want to check it out. Everyone's contact info is on there as well. And we'll just give folks a few minutes or a few moments rather to put their questions in the chat. But like any good panel discussion, we have some pre-canned questions as well. And I will be watching out for those. So yeah, folks, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat.
And if you'd rather raise your virtual hand and speak your question, we can do it that way too.
Well, maybe while we wait for some questions, I know a burning question that I've had and that I've heard from folks as well is uh, what is the project team and what is WashTOT going to do with the broader vulnerability study and the larger list of projects that maybe don't receive the additional attention in this grant because it is a grant-funded project with a short timeline. We're not going to be able to address every target area that is identified, but what's going to happen? How is this going to live on? And how will ideas be escalated beyond the lifespan of this grant?
Well, thanks, Sydney. I can answer that. So, as Sam mentioned earlier, we will be identifying the top 3 to 6 priorities that we could develop into potential, future projects. And we could address those through additional partnerships and pursuing grant opportunities. We might be able to address some of them through larger transportation, state transportation projects. And we could address them potentially through future legislative budget requests in addition to grant opportunities. So yeah, definitely we'll continue with the partnerships into the future, and that's what we plan on doing. Does that answer your question? I can.
Yeah, definitely. Um, I think so.
It'll
I'm
be an
seeing,
ongoing partnership for sure.
yeah, ongoing partnership. I've seen a couple questions about speaking a little bit more about the community engagements that are planned for 2026 and whether specific entities like salmon lead entities and others who are uh, known players, for example, in the restoration or resilience and vulnerability spaces. So yes, so I'll lay out a little bit more about what that process is going to look like. So once we have completed or have a completed product of the vulnerability assessment and also the completed prioritization framework so that we can run the vulnerability assessment and all the sites identified through that VA through the prioritization framework to identify those 3 to 6 target locations for further exploration. At that point, Washington Sea Grant will be um, designing, publicizing, organizing with support from all of the project team, more localized engagements. So it's unfortunate that at this time we can't specifically say, oh, this location and this location and that location on these dates are going to have engagements, but please stay tuned for that. We do have a listserv that maybe one of my co-presenters could pop into the chat if folks want to sign up for more information. But at that time, we are going to be hosting engagements, and we're not exactly sure. I think just depending on timing, availability, budget, all of the things, if these are going to end up being in-person engagements or virtual engagements. I think it also depends on how the top 3 to 6 projects, where they shake out, if they're more geographically clustered or if they're really disparate throughout the state. Just the exact logistics are still TBD, but will be announced through the listserv. And yes, so Juliana, we are going to be leveraging the power of the networks of our different state agency partners to invite engagement from kind of our known groups, like salmon lead entities, for example, are known players, really great partners out there in this space. I think everyone here on this call, I would qualify or think of as someone that we would want to come to these more localized engagements so that we can get your perspectives and feedback on the project locations and the project ideas. But also, we're going to be leveraging knowledge and capabilities around more general community outreach so that we can get community members, maybe local elected officials, local interest groups, local nonprofits, maybe that don't engage as much in the coastal resilience or the ecosystem recovery space, but who are naturally affected by what happens with the roadways, what happens with the ecosystems, et cetera. So stay tuned on that. Please sign up for the listserv. And is there anything else from my co-presenters that you would want to add or clarify about the community engagement? It's hard to share because we can't plan them until we know physically where in Washington they're going to be, but please stay tuned. Yeah, anything else, Sam, Harriet, or Susan, that you want to add about that?
Not anything else. Sydney, you did a really great job of summarizing that. I think, the just to kind of summarize it in a nutshell is because of the timeline we're working on, we're trying to be as efficient as we can with like where does the vulnerability and prioritization process lie, and how can we do the little things now to prep us as best as possible for an abbreviated timeline for community engagement so we do get the appropriate amount of input that we need to effectively engage the communities. That way it's not just like we did it and check the box. We really want that qualitative assessment to ground truth everything we've been doing so far.
Sam,
Yeah.
would you
And
mind?
Cindy, I wanted to give a couple of examples. I mentioned earlier that we could potentially address these projects through partnerships and grant opportunities or legislative requests, and through transportation projects, including like safety and mobility projects, the CED program that Jenny spoke about earlier, and our fish passage program. So there's lots of different avenues in which we could approach and address these projects.
And Sam, I wanted to also pass the spotlight back to you for a second to talk specifically about the tribal engagement, because that is a parallel but slightly different process. So I want to make sure folks understand how we're going about that as well.
Yep. Yeah, there is a concurrent tribal engagement process we're following as well. It- kind of kind of collaborative in the same way of like trying to figure out what the most effective way to do it would be. The tribes were all briefed on the project earlier this year in the summer. So there's been ongoing communication, but also through our individual agencies and the work that I do outside of the project, kind of incorporating some of those conversations and tribal priorities into the mix and knowing who to engage with and how to engage with those folks that I'm hearing from on an ad hoc basis. To summarize all of that together, once we have the vulnerability assessment and prioritization kind of drafted and in place, rolling into the new year here, we'll be taking individual pieces of those areas, similar to what you saw today, where we showed a small example of the prioritization. We'll be taking that overlays with the tribal reservation land and tribally culturally significant land, and using that information to kind of provide the opportunity for feedback and corroboration with the tribes to make sure that we're incorporating anything that we have not been able to uncover through the data-driven approach with those folks individually.
Thank you, Sam. We've gotten a couple questions more on the technical side of the vulnerability assessment, so maybe we can turn our attention to that. One of the first questions that we got from Danielle is asking for the vulnerability and prioritization process, can we say a little bit more about the qualitative and quantitative ranking or scoring that we did? And for a linear system, did we draw segments in some systematic way? So yeah, talking a little bit more about how we are thinking about qualitative and quantitative data, maybe both in the vulnerability assessment and then the prioritization process, because I think maybe those have been two different phases of data management and data analysis with different challenges. So yeah, just is there anyone who wants to cover that first?
I can start on it. I think I'll answer the second question first because it's a little bit more simple. For the linear system, we talked a little bit about how we wanted to approach the segments of roadways we were going to be applying these scores to. And the conversation kind of revolved around like, do we want to follow a similar system that WashDOT uses? Do we want to look at them from like a coastal process based segmentation and look at littoral cells or drift cells or anything like that? I think ultimately we ended up sticking with the linear approach that WashDOT usually follows, which is mileposts for roadway segments for simplicity and also because there was a lot more complication with breaking it out and inconsistencies involving that approach. So we're looking at each roadway from a milepost to milepost segment and applying our various coastal hazards and rankings to those linear segments. For the ranking process, it's actually kind of ongoing at the moment. We're working through how we're going to do that ranking system for the qualitative prioritization. We're kind of breaking it down into several individual categories and having folks from various sides of the project team work within those prioritization categories and understand the data and the vulnerabilities that kind of percolate out of them and how do we effectively score those individual categories, and then ultimately as a group working within each of those to understand, like, do we want to weight certain ones differently than others? How do we want to score, I don't know, for example, erosion against flooding? How does flooding and erosion interact with all of the various infrastructure within this roadway? How do we consider the impacts to access for the communities that rely on these roadways within that weighting? So it's an ongoing process. I wish I could have more detail on it, but it's kind of like a small broken down individual conversation being brought together through the larger group. And feel free to add anything to that as well.
I think I'll just add that the prioritization framework process really highlighted just how hard it is to compare apples and oranges of, okay, what is the environmental justice data set and how do you compare that to erosion frequency or something? Like how do you take not just different types of data, more qualitative, more quantitative, different formats that the agencies might have them in, as Harriet was talking about, different geographic coverage areas, and then where there are gaps, talk to the experts, but then how do you take expert elicitation and compare that to GIS data sets? I think the end product of this grant on paper is going to be a vulnerability assessment gets produced. There's going to be these prioritizations. There will have been community engagements, but the sausage making of getting the different agencies to work together, I think, has been maybe equally important in laying the groundwork for future collaborations, as many folks have alluded to. We did get another technical question. Someone was asking, what types of software are we using to create the risk assessment and prioritization analysis? So, like, the nuts and bolts. How are we doing it? What format? What software are we using?
Yeah, I think, primarily it's an overlay in GIS. But then there's a lot more to it that I don't fully track on a very intricate detail. Our consultant is bringing together experts that work on these um, various individual evaluations in their own pockets, and then that gets brought into the GIS layers for, like, for example, for their coastal hazard mapping. I don't exactly recall um, which models they're using to develop, like, the compound flood scenarios and the overlaying coastal inundation scenarios. Um, there's a couple of different models that are being used, and then for some of the more, like, complicated ones where it was alluded to, where the data sources are just different from the sound versus the Pacific coast. We're trying to be as creative as we can to develop indicator approaches, um, so we can build in more considerations than just what a model domain would involve. So hopefully that clears some things up, but doesn't answer the question fully.
Yeah, I can add on to that. We're looking at different, hazards and overlaying those with transportation assets, such as culverts and bridges and tunnels and roadways and pavements and the CED locations as well. And we're one of our end products will result in an interactive web map based on Esri Experience Builder platform, which will allow us to display the results of the study, that environmental in the transportation vulnerabilities in a way that we can help us identify and help with future project planning. And that will be a public facing web page that we could build upon and add different data sets, including fish and wildlife data sets and others.
Just a quick time check for your information. We have 10 minutes left before we go to our break, so we can continue with some more questions.
Thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, let's maybe shift gears a little bit. That we got a question asking whether the vulnerability assessment, or maybe I'll expand this to the whole project, is it going to include any funding recommendations?
Uh, Perhaps a little bit to be determined. I think it depends on where the projects are and the recommended approaches there to determine what the appropriate funding recommendations could be for each project. Um, if it's straightforward and easy to do so under this grant, we will try to. If not, I think there's other avenues we can explore in order to advance these in the future, as Susan was saying.
Let's see. I want to turn our attention back a little bit to some questions that we've received about environmental justice, and we also received a question about citizen science and any responses that we've gotten from the public so far. So maybe first, those are maybe related, but also different topics. So the first question, I'll ask it directly from Ruby, who's asking, can you speak to what role environmental justice plays in the data collection and prioritization process?
I can, yes. So we are considering. Oh, sorry, my computer's acting up here. We're considering environmental justice as a qualitative assessment tool. It's built into the prioritization process, and there's a slew of different hazard layers and environmental justice layers we're using in consideration of how that fits into the bigger picture. I think it's it's partly like those community-based impacts and geographic-based impacts. I think holistically as a project, as a project, we have those 3 to 6 project areas identified, but we don't want to just say, oh, our biggest areas of concern are within the Puget Sound. We want to kind of geographically space those out across the Sound, the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and the Pacific coast, and make sure that we're both applying our prioritization process equitably in the geographic space, but also in the environmental justice space. And we're not just prioritizing those communities and tribes that are more heavily served in larger economic areas. So the various pieces we're building in address those concerns as well.
And I could just add something, which is, I think, building off what Sam just said, which is how I have really conceptualized the project from the start of, like, to me, the foundation of all of this is WSDOT's coastal infrastructure vulnerability assessment. And then to get at these 3 to 6 priority projects, what we're doing is sort of bringing 3 pieces together of, like, which of those pieces of road that WSDOT is charged with managing are most vulnerable to coastal hazards. So that's like the infrastructure piece. And then we have the communities, or the social sort of branch of this project, which is which coastal communities are going to be hit first and worst by these coastal hazards and the impacts of sea level rise. And I think that's to Sam's point of how do we ensure that our prioritization is really focusing these projects in places that will not only benefit WSDOT's state infrastructure, but will also confer benefit to coastal communities who are at risk first and worst of these coastal hazards, right? And that's being done through various both quantitative data sets that we have at the state level, that we've had at the federal level, and that we have at the local community level to identify where those communities are on the landscape. And then the habitat lens is sort of the how we do that work, right? That nearshore process-based restoration can help confer benefits to both communities who are underserved, as well as confer resilience to the infrastructure. So that's sort of, in my mind, the EJ piece is so central to all of that. While it can be teased apart into one sort of node of the project, it's really sort of in mind quite sequential in terms of how we actually identify where those 3 to 6 projects sit on the landscape within Washington. Which is kind of just a different reframing of what Sam said, but I think of it as a bit more sequential than that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we
thank
will
you.
be gathering that input from communities next spring. We do our main community outreach effort and incorporate that into our framework.
There's a follow-up on that from Alex. Is this impacted by federal grant funding given the current administration approach to EJ? I would say not specifically federal grant funding, but the consideration within this category to the current administration was something that we are talking about. More specifically, there are certain EJ screening tools that have either gone away or have changed as a result of the current administration. So we're kind of balancing what information is available to us and what information is changing in order to hopefully not make any changes to that EJ screening that you would think would be impacted by this federal administration. We're trying to keep it as non-biased as possible to what information is still available.
Thanks, Sam. And I think maybe the last question that we'll cover is someone had asked about the role of citizen science, if it's playing any role in the project. And I would expand that to, like, more broadly where and how citizen feedback and public feedback is going to be incorporated, and if we've encountered any pushback or concerns and how we've gone about addressing it. I guess that's kind of a question for me because it's about the community engagement process. So in a nutshell, I would, from my perspective, citizen science in the way that you might be thinking of it, I would say no, is not incorporated at this stage of the project because the agencies have mainly been using existing data sets, either existing geospatial data sets that are already on the shelf to bring the different agencies' perspectives, or as Harriet talked about, the expertise of regional staff, especially in Region 6. And so in that regards, not explicitly citizen science, though I think informed by a lot of on-the-ground knowledge that comes not only from state agencies, staff expertise, but the work that state agencies have done for years and decades in this space with communities, but not explicitly citizen science in the way that you might be familiar with it. But I think really where the community level expertise is going to come in is during the community engagements that we're going to be doing in spring and early summer, I guess, of 2026, the first half of 2026. That is really where we're going to be putting it all out there and seeing what folks say. And hopefully, we will hear from folks that the areas that are lighting up as hotspots for vulnerability are matching their realities on the ground. Hopefully we're able to flag, where the erosion is happening, where the flooding is happening. But if folks say, yeah, that's great, but actually this is the worst spot, or yeah, that road does flood a lot and it's annoying, but it's really this road that floods when it does flood that causes the biggest problem for our community or poses the most risk to businesses or impacts fishing grounds or something like that. I think that is where we're going to get that local, on the ground, lived knowledge from communities, folks in the broader practitioner space, like all of y'all on the call, from tribal governments, tribal members, staff, etc. So that is where we're going to be pulling in that lived on the ground expertise. Is there anything else that others want to add about that? All right, I'm not hearing anything. I see that we're basically at time. I did see that there were a couple questions that we didn't have a chance to get to, so maybe our team can work on answering those in the chat. But I want to pass it back to Rebecca, who's going to wrap up this portion of the presentation.
All right, welcome back from your break, everyone. And we have one more presentation. Chelsea Buchanan is going to be our presenter for WashDOT, and I'll hand it over to Chelsea.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chelsea Buchanan with Washington State Department of Transportation. I work in the Climate Mitigation and Adaptation branch of the Environmental Services Office. So also in the Environmental Services Office, you've heard today from Jenny Dykstra and also Susan Kanzler. So I have the privilege of working with both of those lovely individuals. And I also have had the privilege of being an observer to the Coastal Vulnerability Study, aka the Triple Bottom Line Study, because of its close relationship to work that I'm doing. So I'm going to try to knit some things together as the closer today, although I would say that my presentation is the least natural resources focused one today. I also just want to put a plug in for what the climate branch does at WashDOT. We have two primary functions. We're a very small office. We're only 4 people, but we function as a coordinating body and also for technical assistance and resources to the rest of WashDOT. WashDOT is doing a ton of climate mitigation work, decarbonization work, as well as transportation efficiency. And that's where most of the dollars from the legislature have come from as it relates to climate change. You might have heard about projects to electrify ferries, lots of vehicle electrification programs, charging programs, public transportation, both expansion of public transportation, but also electrifying public transportation. And the adaptation side is focused on resilience. And it is not quite as well resourced, but we're doing our best with what we have. And what our main project is right now that we're working on is called the Transportation Resilience Improvement Plan, or TRIP. The Transportation Resilience Improvement Plan is a federally funded plan under Protect funds, which are specifically designed for resilience. It's planning dollars, and there are also many other local jurisdictions that are doing one of these plans. Sometimes they call them RIPs instead of TRIPs. So I know of several other jurisdictions that are working on these or similar projects right now as well. So because I've been able to hear the questions for our last couple of presenters, I'm actually going to jump ahead a couple of slides and hit something first that I think will be helpful before I go back to sort of my originally planned order for the presentation. So this isn't the prettiest slide, but I kind of wanted to show where there's overlap and integration between the two things that you're hearing about today in terms of studies. The Coastal Transportation Study, also known as the Triple Bottom Line, and the TRIP, the one that I'm working on. There's lots of differences and lots of nuances between these two. One of the biggest that isn't represented on this slide is that multi-agency focus and the Coastal Transportation Study. It's really a wonderful thing. The TRIP is solely a transportation funded and participating project. Although, like I said, I observe and try to integrate as much as I can with the coastal study. So as you've already heard, the coastal study is focused on 15 coastal counties on the state with a vulnerability assessment and then prioritization framework and picking projects. And it is looking at sea level rise, coastal erosion, and flooding. And it also is looking really pretty much at roads and bridges as its assets. The TRIP is also looking at flooding and roads and bridges. It's not going to duplicate any analysis that's already done in the Coastal Transportation Study. It's also looking at wildfire, earthquakes, and landslides, and especially the integration of hazards that create higher risk for landslides, like high rains or wildfire scarring followed by high rains increase the risk of landslide. And the assets that we're covering in this project are not exclusive to roads and bridges. We're also including WSDOT buildings. It says buildings, but I should say WSDOT buildings. The state-owned airports as well. And both of those latter two are part of our emergency management network, if you will. WSDOT buildings, certain functions like emergency operations centers and traffic management centers, certain kinds of communications equipment, communications buildings are key to our emergency response system and continuity of operations. And the state-owned airports are part of our network for doing staging during disasters and reaching hard-to-reach areas. So that's why those two are included. The benefits piece of both of these studies is also slightly different. The Triple Bottom Line has those three things: habitat, transportation assets, and communities. Because of the funding stream that is powering the TRIP, the benefits are geared towards transportation assets and communities without a habitat frame. What I will say, though, is that when we come to the solution side, the TRIP will initially identify problems. When we come to how do we solve those problems, best practices around, looking at nature-based solutions or the possibility for co-benefits will absolutely be part of the consideration. They just may not be as much of a consideration as is required in the coastal study. Any questions before I move on, just because that was a lot of information? And if someone can help me observe the chat, I'm not entirely sure that I can see a couple things are in the chat. I'm not sure if I can see what they are.
No questions for you, Chelsea, in the chat right now, and I don't see any virtual hands up.
Okay, great. All right, so I'm going to go back to an earlier slide. So, come on, there we go. Touchpad wasn't working for a second. So why are we doing the Transportation Resilience Improvement Plan study now, besides receiving funding for it? Obviously, we want to better understand the climate and natural hazard risks to not only our transportation infrastructure, but also the communities it serves, because that's the whole point. The only reason we have a transportation system is to serve communities. Cars don't, even if they drive themselves, they're driving themselves with people in them. The other big reason about why we're doing this update now, and Susan Kanzler mentioned earlier, the 2011 Climate Impacts Vulnerability Assessment, or CIVA, is that there are a number of things that have changed since that assessment was done. And the biggest one is that our existing infrastructure at WashDOT is severely underfunded for maintenance and preservation. So the system that is designed to serve communities is actually in much worse shape than it was in 2011. And we also have a bigger system to keep track of. We've had a lot of new construction projects authorized by the legislature. That's where their priorities have been. And so there's more to cover also since that time. As Susan already mentioned, we have updated climate projections in science since 2011, especially in the area of precipitation. The SEVA did not include earthquakes, and its analysis of landslides was a little more tangential, whereas this one will be a bit more data-based and based on the interaction of different kinds of hazards. And it will also include more specific asset location data. In other words, where is the problem? Is it at this particular bridge? Is it at this particular milepost? In addition to looking at it based on sections, which the SEVA was more of a section-based analysis. Our website link is there for you to check out if you like. We already reviewed that slide. I wanted to talk a little bit more also about other integration and overlap between coastal and the TRIP, and there are also some other studies that are going on that I'll get to in a few minutes. The idea is to have an updated statewide picture. We're going to have a lot of great detail on the coastal side that I've been so impressed by what I've seen from the consultants and the agency groups working on that study. And I think it's going to be a really robust results. Both the coastal study and the TRIP are using some similar inputs and are going to create some similar outputs. So they both are obviously using climate and hazard data, although in some cases for different kinds of hazards. They're also using asset data about the transportation assets themselves, and they're both using community data. The coastal study will also have that additional layer of all of that fish and habitat data that is not being used in the TRIP. And by the way, I should mention to my colleagues, if I mischaracterize anything about the coastal study or any of your organizations, please correct me either by raising your hand or putting something in the chat. Both studies will also have prioritization factors that look at different things like the impacts on communities, et cetera. I wanted to connect the dots here to the chronic environmental deficiencies program that Jenny presented on earlier. The information about those chronic environmental deficiencies is itself an input into how vulnerable particular areas might be, as well as information around fish passage, unstable slopes, a whole lot of other environmental type data. At the same time, on the output side, if you look at the right side of the slide in that bottom right corner, one of the outcomes of this study could be, both of these studies could be projects that look a lot like a CED project, right? So you're going to see that kind of nexus on both sides of this. The outputs are also for both going to include that mapped data that's publicly available of vulnerability, some sort of a prioritization framework about how to decide what to do next, as well as specific recommendations for what to do next. I noticed there was a question earlier about funding and whether there'll be suggestions for funding recommendations. I can speak to the TRIP on this. I think it's very likely that there will be some, I don't know how pointed those recommendations will be. I know that if I write it and it's not edited, it will be very pointed, but I think it's very likely to be edited somewhat. I think what it's going to do really is reveal the large scope of need in this area and the funding deficiency, which in and of itself is a potential, it's begging the question, how are we going to fund these projects? Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide. This slide is a bit busy, and I'm not going to spend time reviewing all of the grid that you see here in front of you. I'm just going to spend some time on the axes. I wanted to situate both the TRIP and the coastal vulnerability study within WashDOT's broader resilience on climate and natural hazards work. So both the TRIP and the coastal study are on the right side of the slide, and these are studies where the main purpose of the study is around resilience for climate and natural hazards. Our Washington State ferries have also done a vulnerability assessment of their terminals specific to sea level rise, king tide interaction, et cetera. On the left side of the slide, what you see is that WashDOT has major planning efforts in several areas: I-5's master plan, a state rail plan, our state freight system plan. And there is a component of all of those broader efforts that is related to climate and natural hazard vulnerability and resilience, which is good news that we are now integrating that more effectively in our other study work. So as you look at this slide, you'll see what hazards are covered, whether it's covering current and future conditions. And future conditions here is pretty much RCP 8.5, what the outcomes would be, the status, and some contact information. Now I want to just turn to some of the major tasks in our study and what their status is currently. And there are also some parallels here to coastal, but there are also nuances and differences between our two projects. There are times when I wish the projects were joined, and also that I-5's analysis was joined with ours, but as I'm sure you're all familiar, you get different funding streams to do different work. And so then you need to make the effort on the back end to integrate those efforts as well as you can. So task 2 is our vulnerability assessment. That's in progress and should be completed by February. Task 3 is our engagement effort with tribes, with communities, and with other partners, local governments, folks such as yourselves. That's starting up and will get going in earnest in January and February. Task 4, our statewide spatial data, is really a component of task 2. It's making sure we have quality GIS data that we can post on a publicly facing website so that others can access the results of our vulnerability assessment. Task 5 is just beginning now, and that's our prioritization framework for identifying potential actions and projects. Actions could include things like additional study, operational changes, certain maintenance efforts as opposed to a new construction effort. And I just want to take a moment here to distinguish what's happening in the TRIP on this prioritization framework piece from what's happening in the coastal study. So the coastal study is going to be coming in with task 6 on this slide as well. It's going to be, I think, proposing 3 to 6 potential projects. The TRIP is going to have some sort of project list for task 6, but it's going to be evolving over time. I mean, it could be hundreds and hundreds of projects over time. So our initial idea is to come up with a starting place list that makes sense, and then have a framework that is durable over time that we can use to prioritize projects in the future statewide. And then there'll be a final report as well. My intention with the final report is to try to incorporate results from the coastal study and the I-5 study and the ferry study and all of those as best I can. But that is still under development as well. So specific to our prioritization framework, these are some example prioritization considerations. These are not the only ones, or we're actually in the process of figuring this out right now. So WashDOT does have some of its own existing prioritization processes that originate and involve our regions, the workers and folks who are closest to the communities and what they indicate that they need. The other major kinds of considerations we're looking at are safety, benefit to overburdened communities. So this specifically addresses environmental justice issues, the timing of the benefit, how certain the vulnerability is. There's some, less likely but more severe types of events. There's more likely and less severe. Did I say that right? Less likely, more severe, more likely, less severe. The risk to communities of isolation from essential services like healthcare and ability to get, groceries, et cetera. The length of detours, is it going to take 6 hours to detour due to issues? And then the economic impact and cost avoidance to taxpayers. Sometimes, a project now is going to save a lot of money in the future if something happens. We don't always know that it will, but if it did, that would be very costly potentially to human lives and livelihoods, as well as the replacement costs for the project. If a bridge washes away and you have to put it back, it's very expensive. I want to address one other environmental justice question I heard come up earlier. I think the question was asked, how is that being used both in prioritization, but also in data? So this indicates how it could be used in prioritization. We would be using the Office of Financial Management Overburdened Communities map and system, which is used for the HEAL Act and for Climate Commitment Act funds. But on the data side, the input side for the vulnerability assessment, we are using the Department of Health's Environmental Health Disparities Map to guide us to areas that might be much more vulnerable to natural hazards. Our engagement plan, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but essentially we have 2 tracks for engagement. We have general public outreach, which will include tribal members, and then we have more targeted government to government and partner outreach with tribes and local governments, MPOs, which are metropolitan planning organizations, and transportation planning organizations, other partners, which can include groups like this one. We will be submitting or creating some kind of a survey in January or February for the practitioner groups. We'll have listening sessions available, and we'll also have the ability to review a draft plan. These dates are somewhat tentative, but this is what we're planning at this point. Because I've used this slide in other places, I always want to show what the coastal study is doing as well. And where our outreach is more geared towards how do we create this long-lasting, durable framework, which could, help us pick and sift through hundreds and hundreds of projects. The coastal vulnerability, this part of their community engagement effort is really targeted around, okay, what were those hot spots that were identified and what are those potential projects? I hope I said that correctly, but that's my understanding. So that's the end of my presentation. I am very interested in hearing from anyone who's doing transportation related or resilience planning in their local jurisdiction. My contact information is there, and I'm happy to take additional questions. I think I managed to address a few of the ones that came up for the coastal study that would have parallels, but there might be additional ones specific to this study.
We will have time for maybe 2 questions. And if you think of questions later, you've got Chelsea's email address right there on the slide.
Yes, and we are in the process of creating a listserv. I see the coastal study put their listserv in the chat, and I'm waiting for approval on mine right now.
Right, well, I don't see any questions coming in, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.